The morning of October 14th, 1943, 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air temperature sits at -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, positions his Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustav for what should be a textbook interception. Below him, in the crystalline autumn sky, 54, Boeing B-17. Flying fortresses maintain their formation, a geometric arrangement of aluminum and vulnerability that Nock has successfully exploited 33 times before. 12 o'clock high. It is the Luftwaffe's answer to the American daylight bombing campaign, refined through 2 years of brutal trial and experimentation. Approach from directly ahead and slightly above, where the bomber's defensive armament creates a fatal blind spot. Close to within 200 meters, a concentrated fire burst into the cockpit. Break away beneath before the formation's guns can track you effectively. Nock has seen bombers fold in half from this attack. He has watched pilots slump forward over their controls as 20mm cannon shells punched through the greenhouse glass of B-17 cockpits. The tactic works because American bomber design philosophy contained a fundamental geometric flaw: comprehensive defensive coverage everywhere except where it mattered most. But as Nock closes to 800 meters this October morning, something stops him. The nose of every B-17 inches, the lead squadron bristles with gun barrels. Not the single handheld 30 caliber machine gun he expects, dozens of barrels. The entire forward hemisphere of each bomber has been transformed into something he does not recognize. He breaks off his attack. His wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Brettschneider, does not. At 400 meters, Brettschneider's Messerschmitt encounters what American gunners will later describe as a wall of intersecting fire 72 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously from 18 bombers. The Bf 109 disintegrates. Brettschneider does not have time to bail out. This is the story of how the most effective fighter tactic of the early air war became a death sentence. How mathematical precision transformed defensive doctrine. How 12 Browning M2 machine guns, arranged with geometric deliberation, reversed the predator-prey relationship that had governed air combat over Europe for 2 years. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The irony cuts deeper than tactics or technology. The Luftwaffe taught the Americans exactly how to kill them, and then could not adapt when their students surpassed them. To understand how the Luftwaffe dominated American bomber formations in 1942 and 1943, you must first understand what the B-17 Flying Fortress was not. Despite its name, despite the marketing that followed, it from Boeing's design halls into Army Air Corps doctrine, the early B-17 was not particularly well defended against frontal attacks. The B-17E model, the first variant to see combat in Europe, carried 9 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. This sounds formidable until you examine their placement. 2 guns sat in a Sperry top turret, rotating 360 degrees, covering the upper hemisphere. 2 more occupied the Sperry ball turret beneath the fuselage, providing lower hemisphere coverage. 2 waist guns, 1 on each side, covered the beam approaches. A single tail gun protected the rear. 2 additional guns in the radio compartment offered supplementary side coverage. The defensive philosophy was comprehensive coverage through interlocking fields of fire. Every approach vector, except one, received overlapping attention from multiple gun positions. American doctrine assumed that no enemy fighter pilot would willingly fly directly at a bomber formation, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, accepting head-on fire for the brief opportunity to attack. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The front of a B-17E, the entire forward hemisphere from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, was defended by a single 30 caliber machine gun mounted in a flexible socket in the nose. The bombardier operated this weapon when he was not busy with navigation calculations, operating the Norden bomb site, or manually releasing ordnance. The gun itself was handheld, requiring the operator to brace it against his shoulder while standing in a cramped, vibrating space at altitude. At 25,000 feet, where most bombing missions occurred, the bombardier worked in -40 to -50 degree temperatures. His oxygen mask restricted peripheral vision, the greenhouse nose glazing plexiglass panels, offering magnificent visibility for navigation, provided zero protection from incoming fire. A single 20mm cannon shell would turn the entire nose compartment into a killing box of glass fragments and shrapnel. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the cockpit, separated by the central control pedestal, directly behind the bombardier's position. Both men were visible through the nose glazing during a head-on approach. A fighter pilot with reasonable aim could kill or incapacitate both pilots with a single sustained burst, approximately 2 seconds of trigger time. Without pilots, a B-17 became a falling metal coffin containing 8 other crew members. German fighter pilots discovered this vulnerability through experience rather than doctrine. The exact origin of the head-on attack remains disputed among historians, but by late 1942, Luftwaffe units across France and Germany were employing variations of the same basic tactic. Hauptmann Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II receives credit in most historical accounts for systematizing the approach. Meyer, who would eventually achieve 102 confirmed victories before his death in March 1944, recognized that the B-17's defensive weakness was not merely a gap in armament, but a geometric inevitability. The physics were straightforward. A fighter approaching from directly ahead 12 o'clock level or 12 o'clock high presented defensive gunners with an almost impossible targeting problem. The bomber traveled at approximately 180 miles per hour. The fighter approached at between 350 and 400 miles per hour. Combined closing speed, 530 to 580 miles per hour. At 1,000 meters distance, a gunner had approximately 6 seconds before the fighter entered firing range. At 400 meters effective range for a Messerschmitt's nose-mounted 20mm MG-151 cannon, the gunner had less than 3 seconds to acquire, track, and engage a target approaching from dead ahead. Human reaction time, even for trained aerial gunners, is approximately 0.25 seconds. The Sperry turrets required an additional 5 seconds to rotate and elevate to a new target. The flexible nose gun required even longer, as the bombardier had to physically move the weapon and his body to track the target. By the time most gunners could fire, the German fighter had already released its burst and begun its breakaway dive beneath the bomber formation. The tactic's effectiveness was documented in 8th Air Force mission reports throughout late 1942. On October 9th, the 8th Air Force dispatched 108 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds to attack the steel works and locomotive factories at Lille, France. 4 bombers failed to return a loss rate of 3.7%. Every single loss was attributed to frontal attacks. November 23, 1942, Saint-Nazaire, France. The target was the U-boat pens, massive concrete structures housing the submarines that were throttling Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The 8th Air Force sent 85 bombers. 7 did not return. All 7 fell to head-on passes by FW 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader II. January 3, 1943. Saint-Nazaire again. The 91st Bomb Group, known as the Ragged Irregulars, lost 7 of 34 bombers dispatched, 20% casualties in a single mission. German gun camera footage recovered after the war shows Bf 109 seconds, approaching B-17 seconds from dead ahead, firing sustained bursts, then diving away as the bombers shuddered, caught fire, or simply fell apart. The head-on attack became Luftwaffe doctrine, not through official mandate, but through observed success. Fighter pilots shared techniques at unit level. What worked spread organically. By spring 1943, virtually every Jagdgeschwader operating against American bombers employed frontal attacks as their primary intercept method. The Americans understood what was happening. After-action debriefs, combat reports, and testimony from returning crews all confirmed that frontal attacks were responsible for the majority of bomber losses. Intelligence officers examined gun camera footage captured from downed German fighters. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. The question was not whether the B-17 had a defensive vulnerability. The question was what could be done about it. The immediate response was tactical rather than technical. 8th Air Force planners refined the combat box formation, a three-dimensional arrangement of bomber squadrons designed to maximize interlocking fields of fire. A standard combat box placed 18 bombers in a roughly cubic formation, with lead, high, and low squadrons staggered vertically by 1,000 to 1,500 feet. The theory held that even if individual bombers had weak frontal defense, the formation as a whole could create overlapping fire that would deter or destroy attacking fighters. A German pilot approaching from 12 o'clock would face not just one bomber's nose gun, but the side guns and top turrets of multiple aircraft in the formation. The theory failed in practice because the geometry still favored the attacker. Most of the defensive guns that could bear on a head-on target were turret-mounted weapons designed for beam or rear quarter defense. Their rotation speed was insufficient to track a rapidly closing frontal target. By the time gunners could bring their weapons to bear, the German fighter had already fired and broken away. The losses continued to climb. Regensburg and Schweinfurt, August 17, 1943. 230 B-17 seconds dispatched in a shuttle mission bomb Regensburg, continue to North Africa, return days later to bomb Schweinfurt. The plan was ambitious, striking deep into Germany to destroy aircraft manufacturing facilities and ball-bearing production plants. 60 bombers did not return to England or make it to Africa. 295 crew members killed or missing. 27% casualty rate. The Luftwaffe threw 300 fighters at the formations. They attacked in Staffel squadrons of 8 to 12 aircraft, making repeated head-on passes. German pilots reported the Americans maintained formation discipline despite catastrophic losses, but that discipline could not overcome the fundamental problem. The B-17 seconds could not effectively defend themselves from the front. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, faced a mathematical certainty. At loss rates exceeding 10% per mission, his entire bomber force would be statistically destroyed within 10 to 12 missions. Replacement crews were arriving from the United States, but not fast enough to compensate for sustained attrition. Strategic bombing doctrine, the entire theory that heavy bombers could strike decisive blows against enemy industry without fighter escort, was collapsing under the weight of German head-on attacks. The second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, confirmed the crisis. 291 B-17 seconds dispatched. 60 failed to return, 20.6% losses. The mission planners called it Black Thursday. The crews called it a massacre. The 8th Air Force stopped flying unescorted deep penetration missions. For several weeks in late 1943, it appeared the strategic bombing campaign might be suspended entirely. The Luftwaffe had found a tactical solution that American doctrine and technology could not counter. But even as the wreckage of 60 B-17 seconds lay scattered across Germany that October afternoon, the solution was already being installed in bombers at modification centers in England and depots in the United States. The engineering response to the Luftwaffe's head-on attack was neither elegant nor sophisticated. It was blunt, heavy, and brutally effective, a powered gun turret bolted to the underside of the B-17's nose. The Bendix Chin turret, as it became known, consisted of two 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in a remotely controlled housing that protruded beneath the bombardier's station. The bombardier operated the turret through a computing gun sight, using a control yoke to elevate, depress, and rotate the guns through limited arcs covering the entire forward hemisphere. The modification added approximately 1,200 pounds to the bomber's nose, requiring engineers to adjust the aircraft's center of gravity by repositioning equipment further aft. The turret's installation was not simple. It required cutting into the fuselage structure, reinforcing mounting points, and running electrical lines and ammunition feeds through already crowded internal spaces. But the tactical transformation was immediate and profound. The B-17G model, the designation given to fortresses equipped with chin turrets, did not merely add two guns to the nose. Boeing's engineers redesigned the entire forward defensive arrangement. In addition to the chin turret, they added two cheek guns, single 50 caliber machine guns, mounted in flexible sockets on either side of the nose. The navigator operated the port cheek gun. The bombardier operated the starboard gun when not using the chin turret. Total forward armament: 4 50 caliber machine guns dedicated to frontal defense, plus whatever fire the top turret could contribute by rotating forward. The difference between a 30 caliber handheld weapon and 4 power-driven 50 caliber machine guns requires no elaboration. But the true revolution was not in raw firepower, it was in fire control and coordination. The computing gun sight integrated with the chin turret automatically calculated lead angles based on target range, speed, and trajectory. The bombardier no longer needed to estimate where to aim while bracing a heavy weapon against his shoulder. He simply placed the illuminated popper on the target and pressed the firing trigger. The turret's servo motors tracked smoothly, compensating for the bomber's motion and the target's velocity. More importantly, the chin turret could engage targets while the bombardier simultaneously operated other systems. During the bomb run, the final minutes before ordnance release, when the bombardier controlled the aircraft through the Norden bombsight, he could now defend the formation without interrupting his primary task. American defensive doctrine evolved in parallel with the new technology. Rather than individual bombers defending themselves, the combat box formation became a carefully orchestrated kill zone. Each bomber's defensive guns were coordinated to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach vector with multiple weapons. A German fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high no longer faced a single bombardier with a handheld gun. He faced the coordinated fire of 18 bombers' 72 50 caliber machine guns, creating a cone of intersecting tracers that filled his entire approach path. The mathematics of defensive fire had fundamentally changed. Consider the probability calculations. A single B-17E's nose gun, operated by a bombardier dividing his attention between navigation and gunnery, had approximately a 2 to 3% chance of hitting an attacking fighter during a head-on pass. The engagement window was too brief, the closing speed too high, the weapon too inadequate. But 18 B-17Gs, each with chin turrets operated by bombardiers using computing gun sights, firing simultaneously at the same target, 46% probability of at least one hit, and the Browning M2 did not merely damage aircraft, it destroyed them. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round designated M8 API in military nomenclature weighed 72 ounces and left the barrel at 2,910 feet per second. At 400 meters range, it retained sufficient energy to penetrate the engine, cowling of a Bf-109, punch through the engine block, continue through the firewall, and strike the pilot in the cockpit. German fighters were not armored for frontal attacks. Their armor protection, typically 8 to 14 millimeters of steel plate behind the pilot's seat, was positioned to defend against pursuing fighters attacking from the rear. The entire forward fuselage, including the engine, fuel tanks, and cockpit, was vulnerable to 50 caliber fire from dead ahead. A single hit could be catastrophic. Engine destruction, fuel fire, glycol coolant leak, structural failure of wing spars. Any of these outcomes transformed a fighter from an attacker to falling debris in seconds. German pilots did not have ejection seats. They had to manually jettison the canopy, unstrap, and climb out of a disintegrating aircraft while traveling at 350 miles per hour. Survival rate for pilots hit during head-on attacks, approximately 12%, based on Luftwaffe casualty records from 1944. The first B-17Gs arrived in England in December 1943. By January 1944, entire bomb groups were transitioning to the modified aircraft. The Luftwaffe remained unaware of the modification. German intelligence, severely degraded by Allied deception operations and the collapse of espionage networks in Britain, failed to report the chin turret's existence until after German fighters encountered it in combat. The first documented engagement occurred on January 11, 1944. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft assembly plant at Oschersleben, Germany. The 303rd Bomb Group, the Hells Angels, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced units, flew the mission with newly delivered B-17Gs. As the formation crossed into German airspace near Brunswick, elements of Jagdgeschwader 11 and Jagdgeschwader 1 prepared to intercept. The German fighters assembled into standard attack formation, staffel of 8 to 12 aircraft, line astern, preparing for coordinated head-on passes. They came in from 12 o'clock high at 420 miles per hour. 8 Bf 109 seconds in the first wave, throttles at full power, nose-mounted cannons ready, and the entire front of the bomber formation erupted. Technical Sergeant Frank Perez, ball turret gunner aboard the B-17G Jersey Bounce, recorded in his mission diary. The lead German fighters didn't have a chance. Our nose turrets opened up at 800 yards. I could see the tracers converging from every bomber in the lead squadron. The first 3 Messerschmitts just came apart in the air, pieces everywhere. The others scattered. 3 Bf 109 seconds destroyed before they could fire a shot. 2 more damaged and forced to break off. The remaining 3 fighters scattered without pressing their attacks. American losses from the engagement. 0 bombers to frontal attacks. Minor flak damage to 4 aircraft. German pilots radioed reports that made no tactical sense to their ground controllers. Impossible fire concentration from bomber noses. The new turret installation appears to be twin heavy machine guns. Head-on attacks are not recommended. Suggest alternative approach vectors. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, refined over 2 years and validated by hundreds of successful interceptions, had become obsolete in a single engagement. The German response to the Chin turret was not immediate confusion, it was systematic, tactical collapse. By February 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units across Western Europe were reporting that head-on attacks had become prohibitively dangerous. Loss rates told the story with statistical clarity. In 1943, before the widespread deployment of B-17Gs, German fighters attacking bomber formations suffered approximately 8 to 12% casualties per engagement. These were acceptable losses, given the effectiveness of the tactic. A staffel that destroyed 3 or 4 bombers while losing 1 fighter maintained a favorable exchange ratio. By March 1944, German fighter losses during frontal attacks jumped to between 25 and 40% per engagement. More critically, these losses occurred before the fighters could effectively engage the bombers. German pilots were being shot down during their attack run, not during withdrawal or pursuit. The exchange ratio had reversed. American gunners were destroying more German fighters than German fighters were destroying bombers. Luftwaffe tactical commanders attempted adaptation. Some units shifted to attacks from the rear quarter, the classic pursuit curve approach, where the fighter overtook the bomber from behind and slightly below. The B-17's tail guns and ball turret could engage these attacks, but the approach vector gave gunners more time to track and fire. The problem was that rear quarter attacks were slower, required longer exposure to defensive fire, and forced German fighters to operate in the most heavily defended zone of the combat box formation. Additionally, American fighter escorts P-47 Thunderbolts and increasingly P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks were becoming more effective at intercepting German fighters before they could position for attack runs. Other Luftwaffe units experimented with standoff tactics. Twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410 Zerstörer firing unguided rockets from outside defensive gun range. The Werfer Granate 21, a 21-centimeter rocket with a 40-pound warhead, could theoretically destroy a bomber with a single hit. Accuracy was abysmal. The rockets were unguided, ballistic projectiles fired from approximately 1,000 meters. Wind drift, variations in rocket motor performance, and target motion made hitting a specific bomber nearly impossible. Additionally, the twin-engine Zerstörer were slow, vulnerable targets for American escort fighters. P-51 pilots called them meat on the table. Some Jagdgeschwader attempted massed attacks. 30 to 50 fighters approaching simultaneously from multiple vectors, hoping to overwhelm the defensive fire through sheer numbers. These tactics occasionally succeeded but required extensive coordination and consumed enormous fighter resources for marginal returns. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. The Luftwaffe had built its bomber interception doctrine around the head-on attack, the single most effective method of destroying B-17 seconds. That method was now suicidal. Every alternative was a compromise, a retreat to less effective tactics, and the Americans were not merely defending, they were hunting. Operation Argument. The planners called it Big Week. 6 days in February 1944, the 20th through the 25th, when the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force launched maximum effort raids against German aircraft production facilities. The strategic objective was not subtle: force the Luftwaffe into combat, destroy German fighters in the air and on the ground, eliminate the industrial capacity to replace losses, achieve air superiority through attrition. 3,800 bomber sorties, 6,000 fighter escort sorties. The target list included every major aircraft assembly plant in Germany: Messerschmitt at Regensburg, Focke-Wulf at Oschersleben, Junkers at Aschersleben, Heinkel at Rostock. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to defend. These facilities represented the entire future of German fighter production. If they were destroyed, the Luftwaffe would slowly suffocate from lack of replacement aircraft. German fighters rose to intercept in unprecedented numbers. On February 22nd alone, Luftwaffe records indicate over 400 fighters engaged American bomber formations over central Germany. The Americans lost 226 bombers during Big Week's significant losses, but within sustainable replacement capacity. American industrial production delivered 500 new heavy bombers per month to European theater operations. The lost aircraft could be replaced within 2 weeks. The Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters and, more critically, approximately 100 pilots killed. These were not replaceable losses. German fighter pilot training had been compressed from 18 months to 6 months due to fuel shortages and training aircraft losses. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight hours and almost no gunnery or tactical training. The experienced Staffelkapitän squadron leaders with hundreds of combat hours were dying faster than they could be replaced. These men were not merely pilots, they were the institutional knowledge of the entire fighter force. They understood defensive tactics, formation coordination, radio discipline, recognition of bomber types, and approach vectors. When a veteran German pilot died, his knowledge died with him. The kill ratio, during Big Week, demonstrated the reversal: 0.7 bombers destroyed per German fighter lost. The Luftwaffe was losing the attrition battle despite fighting over its own territory, with shorter flight distances, friendly recovery fields, and interior supply lines. The defensive gunners, the men sitting in those ball turrets and waist gun positions and chin turrets for 8 hours at -50 degrees, were outscoring the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological transformation of Luftwaffe fighter pilots during this period is documented in personal diaries, unit records, and post-war interviews with survivors. The language shifts from confidence to caution to something approaching despair. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, the same pilot who broke off his attack over Schweinfurt in October 1943, maintained a detailed combat diary throughout the war. His entries from early 1944 chart the morale collapse in real time. January 1944. The Americans have modified their bombers with additional nose armament. Frontal attacks now extremely hazardous. Several pilots lost today attempting standard approach. February. Every mission costs us pilots we cannot replace. The new men arrive with perhaps 60 flight hours. They do not survive their first week. We are no longer wolves hunting sheep. We are being hunted. March. I will not order my pilots to attempt head-on attacks. It is suicide. We try beam attacks, rear approaches, nothing works. The American escort fighters are everywhere. If we position for an attack, the Mustangs intercept us. If we evade the escorts, the bomber defensive fire destroys us. April. We have lost the air war. This is not defeatism, it is mathematics. We cannot sustain current loss rates. The Americans replace their losses within days. Our losses accumulate. Every dead pilot is irreplaceable. Noakes survived the war. Most of his squadron did not. The statistics validate his assessment. In January 1943, a newly trained Luftwaffe fighter pilot, arriving at an operational unit in Western Europe, had approximately 70% chance of surviving 6 months. By January 1944, that survival rate had dropped to 45%. By June 1944 D-Day, it was below 30%. Life expectancy for German fighter pilots in Western Europe, approximately 40 flight hours in combat. Most pilots did not complete 30 missions. Contrast this with American bomber crews. In 1943, before the Chin turret and long-range escort fighters, the survival rate for completing a 25-mission combat tour was approximately 30%. By mid-1944, it had risen to 65%. B-17 crews had better odds of surviving their combat tour than Luftwaffe, and pilots had of surviving 6 months. The reversal was not merely tactical, it was existential. The Luftwaffe fighter force was being systematically destroyed through attrition it could not sustain. German aircraft production actually increased through 1944, despite Allied bombing. Dispersed factories, underground facilities, and slave labor kept fighters rolling off assembly lines. In March 1944, Germany produced 2,300 fighters, the highest monthly production of the entire war. But aircraft without pilots are useless, and Germany could not produce pilots at the rate it was losing them. By D-Day June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost control of the skies over Western Europe, not because they lacked aircraft, but because they lacked the pilots and tactics to employ them effectively. On June 6, the Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew over 14,000. German fighters that did appear were immediately swarmed by Allied escorts, or engaged by the coordinated defensive fire of transport aircraft, gliders, and paratrooper drop zones. The Germans called it Jabo-Angst fighter-bomber fear. The sight of Allied aircraft, any Allied aircraft, induced immediate psychological stress in German ground troops because it meant the Luftwaffe was not present to defend them. The Chin turret was not solely responsible for this collapse. Long-range P-51 Mustang escorts deserve enormous credit. Improved American tactics, numerical superiority, better training, radar-directed intercepts, superior logistics all contributed. But the transformation of the B-17 from a vulnerable target into an actual flying fortress changed the fundamental mathematics of air combat. It removed the Luftwaffe's ability to inflict unsustainable losses on the bomber stream. It forced German fighters into approaches that favored American defensive fire. Most critically, it destroyed the psychological advantage the Luftwaffe had held since 1942. The certainty that they could kill bombers faster than the Americans could replace them. The engineering modification cost approximately $1,500 per aircraft, roughly $23,000 in 2025 currency. Boeing's modification centers in England could install Chin turrets at a rate of approximately 15 aircraft per day. By May 1944, over 70% of operational B-17 seconds in the European theatre were G models with Chin turrets. The remaining E and F models were being rotated back to depots for modification or retired to training duties. The Luftwaffe never developed an effective counter-tactic. Various experimental approaches were attempted: fast-climbing attacks from directly below, diving attacks with heavy cannons, even ramming tactics by specially trained Sonderkommando Elbe pilots who would deliberately collide with bombers. None achieved the consistent effectiveness of the head-on attack in 1942 and 1943, and most resulted in German pilot losses that exceeded bomber kills. By autumn 1944, standard Luftwaffe fighter doctrine had devolved to desperation. Attack only when absolutely necessary. Avoid bomber formations whenever possible. Focus on stragglers and damaged aircraft that had separated from defensive formations. The Jagdwaffe, the fighter arm, was being husbanded for defense of the Reich against Soviet advances in the east. The strategic bombing campaign continued with declining German fighter resistance. Total American bomber losses to all causes in the European theatre from 1942 through May 1945, approximately 6,600 aircraft. Of these, roughly 38% occurred before December 1943 before widespread Chin turret deployment. Loss rates declined from approximately 10 to 15% per mission in 1943 to 4 to 7% in 1944. The decline cannot be attributed solely to the Chin turret, but operational records clearly demonstrate reduced effectiveness of German frontal attacks after January 1944. American defensive gunners claimed approximately 6,000 German fighters destroyed during the campaign. German records confirm approximately 4,400 fighter losses to bomber defensive fire. The discrepancy represents overclaiming, common in air combat when multiple gunners engage the same target. 4,400 German fighters destroyed by defensive gunners. Men sitting in ball turrets and waist positions and chin turrets, often teenagers barely out of high school, operating weapons in -50-degree temperatures while wearing oxygen masks and flying through flak and fighter attacks. The transformation of the B-17 was not merely about adding guns. It was about recognizing that defensive doctrine required the same engineering precision and tactical sophistication as offensive operations. The Americans had entered the war with a bomber designed around peacetime assumptions that formations could defend themselves through distributed, individual fire. The Germans taught them otherwise. The head-on attack was a lesson written in burning aluminum and dead crew members. Your defensive doctrine is inadequate. The American response was characteristically industrial and systematic. Identify the vulnerability. Engineer a solution. Manufacture it at scale. Deploy it rapidly. Refine tactics to maximize effectiveness. The Chin turret represented applied learning, the willingness to recognize failure, adapt technology, and implement changes quickly enough to matter strategically. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the strategic bombing campaign had dropped 1.5 million tons of ordnance on German industrial targets. The debate over strategic bombing's effectiveness continues among historians, whether it shortened the war, whether it justified the casualties, whether alternative strategies might have achieved similar results with fewer losses. But there is no debate about the Chin turret's tactical effectiveness. It transformed the B-17 from a vulnerable bomber into a weapons platform that could survive and defend itself in contested airspace. It reversed the predator-prey relationship that had threatened to end the daylight bombing campaign. 12 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, arranged in a powered turret, defended by interlocking fields of fire calculated with geometric precision. The Luftwaffe's most effective tactic became their fatal vulnerability. The Americans learned what the Germans taught them, and then learned faster than their teachers could adapt. In the frozen sky over Germany, at 26,000 feet, where the air temperature reached -50 degrees and oxygen meant the difference between consciousness and death, young men sat in gun turrets for 8 hours at a time. They tracked targets moving at 400 miles per hour. They fired 50-caliber machine guns that produced recoil forces capable of injuring shoulders and breaking fingers. They defended their aircraft, their crew, their formation. They turned mathematics and industrial production and tactical doctrine into survival. The B-17 Flying Fortress finally lived up to its name, not because of its design, but because men made it so. The Chin turret was engineered, the kill zones were tactics. But the reversal of the air war was human. The willingness to recognize failure, learn from enemies, and adapt faster than the operational tempo of combat normally allows. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock survived the war. He was shot down twice, wounded multiple times, and witnessed the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force he had joined as a confident young pilot in 1940. In his post-war memoir, published in 1953, he wrote about the moment he first encountered Chin turrets over Schweinfurt. We had become accustomed to a certain pattern of attack. It had worked for 2 years, and then, suddenly, it did not work anymore. The Americans had learned. They learned faster than we could teach them. That is the final irony. The Luftwaffe created the problem that destroyed them. Their own tactical excellence, the head-on attack that killed so many bombers in 1942 and 1943, forced the Americans to develop a solution. And once that solution appeared, the Germans had no answer. By October 1944, exactly 1 year after Nock broke off his attack over Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe fighter force in Western Europe was a shadow force. Experienced pilots were dead. Replacement pilots arrived with inadequate training and died within days. Aircraft sat on airfields without fuel. The industrial capacity to produce fighters remained, but the tactical capacity to employ them effectively had collapsed. The Americans continued flying, 8-hour missions, 30 bombers, 50 bombers, 100 bombers. They flew through flak that could tear aircraft apart. They flew despite losses that would have ended any previous air campaign. They flew because the defensive technology and tactics had evolved to the point where survival was statistically probable. The daylight strategic bombing campaign, derided by British commanders as impossible, nearly cancelled after Black Thursday, written off by German intelligence as unsustainable, continued until there were no targets left to bomb. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.